Desiree, do you want to start it off?
Sure.
Sounds good.
So welcome everyone. Today on our Let's Talk About Cancer, we have Dr. Jeff Burgess with the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health. And we are going to talk to him about his research with occupational exposures, environmental exposures, and how that plays into the health of first responders, firefighters, miners. So yeah, thank you for joining us, Dr. Burgess. And we'll just get started with the first question. So may you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do at the U Arizona Cancer Center?
Sure. As Desiree said, my name is Dr. Jeff Burgess, and I have a few roles at the university. I'm the Associate Dean for Research at the University of Arizona Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health. I'm also a professor there, and a principal investigator, which is kind of the lead scientist on a number of different studies, including a lot specifically around firefighter health and safety and firefighter cancer.
Excellent. So Dr. Burgess, my name is Octavio. I'm a health educator with the Cancer Center. To continue along with our questions here, could you talk to us about your career as a medical doctor?
Sure. Well, I started off in medical school at University of Washington in Seattle. And then after I did that, I came down here to Tucson to do training in emergency medicine. So it was an emergency medicine residency. It lasted 3 years. And while I was down here, I became interested in medical toxicology, which is the study of people that are exposed to toxic substances. So for most emergency docs that do that, they end up working with poison centers. So I work with the Arizona Poison and Drug Information Center here. And most of those cases that they get are either children who get into their parents' prescription medicines, or older individuals that have unfortunately purposefully taken an excess of various medications that they might have on hand. So a lot of that is very focused on emergency medicine. But what I became interested in while I was doing that was the whole issue of workplace and environmental exposures. We began by focusing on individuals that were exposed in their workplace. I was also interested a lot in things like rattlesnake envenomations, but then substances like arsenic that might be in our water. So I went from that fellowship in medical toxicology, working with the Poison Center, and then I went back up to the northwest of the Seattle area and did an occupational medicine fellowship and some research up there before I ended up coming back down here. So I've done emergency medicine, medical toxicology, and occupational medicine. But right now I'm more focused on research and some administration and don't do the clinical part anymore.
And you touched a little bit on this. So how did your career as a medical doctor lead to becoming a researcher?
That's a great question. And I think generally you follow things you're interested in. So I've always been interested in answering questions that were important for people so that, that you could take that information and make more informed choices. So I'd say that, one of the things was even when I first started out, how do you best treat a rattlesnake bite? And there were a lot of questions back then about how to do it, what the treatment is. And, we came up with the question, should you put a constriction band? That's not a tourniquet. And I don't recommend this. You shouldn't do anything. You should just go to the hospital. You get a bite. Don't put any of this on there. Like, don't put constriction bands. Don't put tourniquets on. Absolutely not. Don't do it. But we had the question at the time is, a constriction band, like a very light pressure, would that be better or worse? So we did some studies on that with animals, and I discovered that I don't like doing animal studies really. I'd much prefer to work with people than animals. But that was one question. And then we got into questions. I started to work a little bit with questions about how good is the respiratory protection that firefighters use. And that was the first time I started working with firefighters. And it just went from there. So if you talk with firefighters or anybody who's in the public, the community, they'll have questions that they want to have answers to. And if it hasn't already been answered, that's a good research topic.
Excellent. So there's this kind of organic way that this developed. There was a need, and you saw a way to reflect that need in your work.
Yeah.
Because I believe that our next question was how were you interested in environmental exposure and its impact on occupational health? So that pretty much covers it, right? You were seeing that firefighters, for example, were going through this exposure, and you saw a way to fit your research there.
Yeah, exactly. So we had the questions down here about how well their self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBA, those tanks they wear on their back. When you see the picture of them going in, they've got a face piece on, right, and all the heavy turnout gear. And we just want to know how well those things work. So they do work really well if they're fit tested and they go through all the proper occupational things. And then when I was up in Seattle, I had to do the medical surveillance on the firefighters. So every year they get an exam, and then you look and make sure that there's nothing abnormal there, or that they're not dropping in different study parameters like lung function more than they should over time. So we discovered that one test was showing that they were definitely not in the normal range. And we did some studies with them to figure out what might be going on. And it turned out it had to do with, the number of fires they went to. And that took us to a big question about how much do firefighters get exposed when they can't even see smoke? And it turns out they get exposed heavily, potentially heavily, even though you can't see the chemicals in the air, when there's smoke around. And so that led us to tell them to wear their SCBA during that phase when they would otherwise think the fire had gone out. It's called overhaul, when they're making sure it doesn't restart up again. So that really started the whole things that we're going into now, including the cancer type of issues. It all had to deal with looking at the exposures that they had and determining whether those exposures were causing them injury or not.
Thank you for talking a little bit about the firefighters. I'm going to shift it a little bit. We did look at your bio on MESCOP and the Cancer Center website, and it did mention that you've done research with arsenic exposure. So may you talk a little bit about your research with the arsenic in food and water, and how your interest was sparked in that particular area of research?
Sure. I'm trying to remember. Okay, now I do. So the first time that we ever worked with arsenic, there was a community, actually it still is, Hayden Winkleman in Arizona, right between kind of here and Globe, depending on which way you go to Globe. And they're right next to a copper smelter. And the people in the community were very worried about being exposed to things that would come out of the copper smelter. And the two things that you worry about most generally, with copper smelters, actually there's the main one thing that you worry about is arsenic. There are other things that can come out as well, but like, for example, lead. But arsenic historically has been a significant problem, and they currently have all sorts of controls to help reduce the amount that came out. But in the old days, they didn't have as much control, and so you get a lot more arsenic that was spread around from the stack than you would otherwise have. So we did an evaluation of the community. It was a contract with the Arizona Department of Health Services where we collected urine on people to look for arsenic and blood to look for lead. And what we found is at the time that no one exceeded any of the occupational kind of standards that were out there for those chemicals. But, you know, that started me thinking about arsenic and you know, there's still, since that time, the standard has reduced. So what's an acceptable amount of arsenic in your urine is much lower now than it was years ago. It was around 50 previously, now it's 10. So some of those people by today's standards would exceed the current, in this case, environmental exposure limits. So it just shows you that, you know, as a society, we often change what we consider to be acceptable over time. Generally, it gets more stringent over time.
So a lot of your research involves miners, but also first responders like firefighters. So which cancers have been shown to be more prevalent or just more common among those groups of people that, because of their occupation, are being exposed to these you know, really toxic things that are getting into their bodies?
Sure. Let me kind of continue on the arsenic bit before I talk about on the cancer. I'm thinking about, you know, what I just said, and it could provide a little more information on that. And then I'll return back to the miners and firefighters. So arsenic exposure is associated with a lot of different cancers. And ever since that first study I talked about, we've had a chance to look at other populations, particularly many different places in Arizona and also down in the state of Sonora in Mexico. And what we found is that, honestly, even the current levels, which is 10 parts per billion, which is the EPA maximum contaminant level, is not adequately protective against cancer. We're finding effects, things that we can measure in the body, even at levels below that. So ideally, that level should be dropped down. And so that's just, and there's many different cancers that arsenic can be associated with. There's lung cancer, there's skin cancer, for example. There's other cancers as well. But there are, in that case, you know, arsenic can lead to many different types of cancers, not just one. Now, for miners, really the biggest concern is for underground miners. Surface miners, you know, you do have to worry about some things, but the exposures aren't nearly as high. For miners, silicosis, you know, from silica exposure is a big deal. I think as probably a number of the listeners know on today's talk on the Navajo Nation in the days of uranium mining, a number of the Navajo miners were exposed to radon, right, and developed lung cancer from that as well. So radon is a problem. In most mines, they can control it pretty well, most modern mines. It's different than the situation on the Navajo Nation, you know, back particularly in the World War II era, right? But the concern nowadays for them more than anything is diesel exhaust. So most of the mining equipment is powered by diesel engines. The exhaust comes out, and diesel particulate matter is a known carcinogen. It can cause lung cancer, some other cancers as well, but particularly lung cancer. So that's the problem there. For firefighters, there's a whole ton of different cancers that it's associated with. It's really quite surprising, and it varies by the study. So it can be lung cancer, gastrointestinal cancer from the esophagus all the way down to the rectum, kidney cancer, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, all forms of leukemia, brain cancer, skin cancer. So they have very many different risks from their exposures. So it's just really, you know, a difficult situation. It's something they really have to battle to try to prevent.
Thank you for elaborating on arsenic and how it can contribute to cancer. And thinking about, you talked a little bit about diesel particulates and how that can cause cancer as well. So thinking about more sustainable sources of energy, where we move more to like solar energy or wind energy, do you think those types of sources of energy would eliminate exposure to toxic emissions and reducing cancer rates for those exposed to those higher rates of emissions on the job?
Oh, absolutely. I think that as we move steadily towards electric vehicles, you know, which is happening already, right? And it will continue to proceed in the future, that exposures will be reduced. Some mining companies have already tried, you know, electric powered equipment, you know, so, or in other cases, they may try to pull people out entirely and have autonomous mining without people there. Right, so you know, there's still people that are going to have to go in and do maintenance, et cetera, but they, you know, they can control their exposures for a shorter period of time much better. So I do think that over time, exposure to diesel particulate will go down because we'll have cleaner. We already have much cleaner burning engines and pollution control than we did before. The newer trucks, for example, on the road are so much cleaner than they were before. However, long term, I think that we're going to see even those diesel engines, the newer ones, probably be replaced by electrical.
Yeah, and it strikes me as we're talking about this stuff that it can be more concerning, right? Or more, so the mining exposure and stuff is more like industry centered. So even more of a reason for us to hold them accountable and have regulations as opposed to something like firefighting, right? It's a reaction to something happening, and we absolutely have to ensure safety and that our firefighters are taken care of. But it just strikes me as we're talking about this, the different issues that can present with talking about holding mining industries accountable for keeping workers safe, and to kind of want them to invest in things like clean energy, but really it comes down to something like their bottom line and the public holding them accountable.
Well, I think, you know, if you look at the safety history of U.S. mines, they've really improved over the years. I mean, you can look at any trend and you can see a reduction in injuries over time. There's no question about that. And I think that, you know, it is a better workplace in general for most mines. There are some problems. There have been some cases of silicosis that have come up, particularly in the Appalachian region of the U.S. and some of those coal mines. But you know, by and large, I think they've done a good job of taking care of their workers in most mines, right? And it has improved over time. I think you bring up, Octavio, a really good kind of comparison between the setting of mining, which is easy. It's not easy, but it's easier to control the conditions there because, you know, you're doing it as part of a regular operation. You can make sure that you've got good ventilation. You can make sure that people have the right personal protective equipment and all that, right? But for firefighting, they can control their environment to a certain extent, but there's a lot of unknowns where, you know, the fire can all of a sudden just take off, or the wind changes direction, or all sorts of things that make it more challenging because the exposures can change from 1 minute to the next.
Exactly. So for firefighters, is it really the smoke inhalation that poses the biggest concern, or is it the actual chemicals that they're using to fight the fire, or is it the fact that these things are combining and they're getting sometimes both?
Great questions, and I think the answer probably to all of them would be yes.
Okay.
You know, so inhalation is still a big deal, and we can't forget that. And as I mentioned previously, you can get exposed if you're a firefighter to hazardous chemicals, even if you don't have visible smoke. When you actually see smoke, that's really high concentrations of chemicals in the air. So breathing in these chemicals is a big issue, and the firefighters need to continue to reduce their exposures as much as they can. And if we have a chance, we can come back and talk about a few of the things that Tucson Fire Department has been doing as part of our community engaged research with them. It's a partnership, it's a collaboration. And so they've taken the information and they put some interventions in place to reduce their inhalation exposures, for example. The other source of exposure is actually getting the soot on your skin. And I don't think, you know, probably 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't appreciate how important this is. You can be wearing your respiratory protection very well, but you can still get, particularly if you're going inside a fire with all the gear on, that soot will get inside your turnout gear and deposit on your legs and your arms. And now you have a high temperature setting. You know, it's better inside the turnout gear than outside, but obviously it's still hot in there. And they can absorb some of those chemicals right through their skin. And they do absorb chemicals through their skin. So it's another important thing to try to reduce that exposure right away. And again, Tucson Fire Department has been doing some washdowns right when the people come out to reduce their exposure, and we've shown that that's effective too. In addition, as you said, Octavio, there may be some things that the firefighters use that can put them at risk too, of potentially cancer, maybe some other effects too. For example, there's something called aqueous film forming foam, or AFFF, that if you're in an airport and you're a firefighter and there's an airplane on fire, you need to put that fire out right away. And some of the most effective foams for putting that fire out right away to save the people in the plane, right, have these fluorine-containing chemicals called PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And those chemicals, particularly some of the older PFAS chemicals, are known to have adverse effects, including some that are associated with cancer. So it's probably a combination of those, but yet on top of it, shift work causes cancer. You know, if you're doing shift work, you know, and rotating shifts or nighttime shifts, that can increase your risk too. So it might be all the combination of those that help lead to their increased risk of cancer.
So thinking about Arizona has a high wildfire season. So thinking about, you know, the wildfire season, are there any big health concerns in Arizona for the lay public in regards to wildfires and in Arizona, and like how maybe the Bighorn fire in Tucson might have affected the population in the communities around where it occurred?
Well, we do know that increased pollution in the air can result in worsening of conditions that particularly conditions that people already have, right? So if, for example, if you have underlying, you know, heart disease and you're breathing a lot of particles, it can make your heart disease worse, may cause a heart attack. Same thing with, you know, pulmonary disease. It could make your pulmonary disease get worse. Clearly, someone who has asthma and is reactive to irritants in the air, anytime you get a fire, you have a lot of irritants, that can worsen that as well. So there's no question in my mind that, you know, if you can avoid smoke, you should, including wildfire smoke. Obviously, you should never smoke cigarettes, right? Just a bad idea in general. Not good for you, it's expensive, you know, there's just no reason for it. And, you know, you consider, it's not, you know, wildfire smoke is different than tobacco smoke, but neither of them are good for you. So if you can avoid it, you should. You know, stay indoors when the smoke's out. Don't go out and exercise, right? You know, if it's smoky like it has been sometimes in some parts of Tucson with the Bighorn fire. I would say, though, that we don't know how long those health effects from these limited periods of time that you're exposed last. It's very different if you're a firefighter and you're being exposed, multiple days for prolonged periods of time for years to smoke. It's a different setting than someone who gets exposed to wildfire maybe for a week or so, maybe not at particularly high levels. So I think it's not good for people, but I don't know how long those effects last. Like, for example, are we still having problems from the Bighorn fire, from exposure to the Bighorn fire now? I don't know that we are. Again, there's probably a good area for research to tell that, but certainly at the time of exposure to the fire, there are adverse effects.
Very interesting. And yeah, that makes me think of a couple of things, like when you mentioned it getting on your skin and how that is not good either. A lot of the new research and awareness pointing towards cigarette smoke and what's called third-hand smoke. So we're already aware of being exposed to someone smoking, but what about someone who has smoked, has those chemical or whatever residue on them, and then goes to like pick up a baby or something, and the effect that might have, or just these lingering toxins that, even though they're invisible, they're still harmful, which we're all aware of with things like the pandemic going on, something that's invisible, that it's very dangerous, that we need to be aware of, and coupled something that affects your respiratory system with a wildfire, all these things happening at the same time, not good. But the other thing it made me think of was that chemical retardant that they sprayed on the fire. Does that have any lingering long-term effects?
It's, again, an excellent question. I have not looked into that directly myself. So I think it's always good, as you know, that if you hear something, you should check into it yourself just to make sure that what you're hearing is correct, right? So I don't know, but someone had told me a while ago, someone who I trust, had said that this is essentially the most of that material is fertilizer, and it's meant to hold on to water. And that this person did not find clear evidence that there was bad stuff in it, but I don't know that myself. I've not really looked into that question to answer it myself in terms of whether there's any harm to it. Again, what I've heard is that it isn't, at least to the people that might be exposed to it, but I don't know for sure.
We're talking a lot about firefighters, and I'm actually a doctoral student in the policy and public health policy and management. And so in some of the courses that I've taken so far, we've had to do bill tracking and following state legislation bills that went forward with a legislative session that started in earlier this year. And one of those bills was Senate Bill 1160, which is also referred to as the Firefighter bill. Just to give some context to those, this was a bill put forward by Senator Heather Carter, and it was to get compensation for firefighters who may have been exposed, who are diagnosed with cancer and may have had occupational exposure. So do you mind sharing a little bit more about that bill and the work that you contributed toward how that bill has moved forward in the state legislature?
Sure. My experience with firefighting and legislation about firefighter cancer actually started in a previous bill that actually passed and became law, where they were expanding the number of cancers that were included under the presumptive cancer laws for firefighters. What that means is that, the way that this should have worked is that if you had a particular cancer, let's say leukemia, I think that was in the first group, and then they expanded to some others, and you're a firefighter, and you've been working for at least a certain number of years as a firefighter, that cancer would be considered presumptive, that it was known to be associated with firefighting. Therefore, the workers' comp, unless there was something unusual going on, like maybe the person was a smoker themselves or something like that, that case should have been accepted under the workers' compensation law. And then therefore, that person would have additional resources to be able to seek the best care that they could get for their cancer. So to get a workers' compensation case accepted is a big deal, because if you don't, you have to stick with your regular insurance, and you may not have the options for care that you would if, as in the situation in which your cancer was accepted as a workers' compensation case. So we had presented some of our research about exposures in firefighters and the effects of those exposures during a previous Senate or House session. And again, that got passed into law, and you know, everyone's quite happy with it because it provided this presumptive case law for firefighters. The problem came is that despite the presumptive law, firefighters were routinely and still continue to have their cases denied, even though they have cancers that are listed under the presumptive cancer list. I mean, that's really hard, because now a firefighter is battling cancer, they're battling their workers' compensation claim, right? And they don't have access to the best care possible. There are some exceptions to that. Thankfully, I think due to some of the work we've had, for example, in a very sad case, a Tucson firefighter died of cancer and had her case accepted right away, which I think is, you know, part of what we want to get to for everyone. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen for everyone. So Senator Carter, seeing this happen, you know, to people in her district and all through other parts of Arizona who are firefighters, and getting their cases turned down again and again, despite being on the presumptive list, really wanted to put forward that, you know, that the municipalities that were hiring these firefighters needed to accept and not fight these cases that fell under the presumptive law. And so that's what that was about. And we presented our information on it, and a number of firefighters talked about the very difficult situations they've had to gone through in terms of fighting the workers' compensation cases. So I'm not sure if that answered all your questions, Desiree, or not.
Yes, it did.
Yeah, so just following up on just how the process went, did you have to speak before committees and do like expert testimony? And what would your advice be to someone who might be looking at going through something like that?
So I was part of an ad hoc committee that was put in place to discuss this. So there's certain Senate committees that meet regularly, and the ad hoc committees are for a special purpose of, you know, considering, I don't know how else they use them, but in this case, it was for considering this new legislation. And yes, as part of it, presented our research, others presented their research, and we were there when yet other people, including firefighters, were presenting their information and their testimony. For anyone who's interested in doing this type of work, they first need to start talking with our state relations folks. So the person that I spoke with predominantly was Sabrina Vasquez. She works for the university. She knows the political process, and she's there to make sure that we follow the letter of the law and to provide us lots of advice about, you know, how to be effective in our roles. But again, we're not allowed to advocate for legislation. We are allowed to inform people and share the results of our research. So I think we certainly can and should share our expertise, but we have to do it in a way that's legally acceptable in our role as University of Arizona employees. Now, if you want to say something outside of your time as U of A employee, you can do that. That's all of our right. But if you're going to be saying it in your role as a University of Arizona employee, you have to follow our laws. We can't be, again, advocating for particular legislation. So that's probably the most important thing, is just have someone, such as Sabrina, tell you what you can and cannot do, right, legally. And then also it's good to know what type of information and how to present things. And so that's always a good idea too, because you want to know who your audience is and provide information that's useful, but not excessive, right, for getting to the point at hand.
Thank you. My next question is more toward community members and what you believe or what you may think community members could do to show their support. I'll be honest, as a community member, I wasn't very familiar with the legislative process in the state. And so going through a lot of the coursework has taught me how to, as a constituent of my community, how to show support or be against certain bills in the state. So do you have any advice or recommendations for community members and how they can put efforts toward legislations in the state?
There's people who know a lot more about that than me, honestly. I'll start off by saying that. I mean, I would hope that if you had a state representative, your state, House or Senate member who represented you, that you would want to tell them about your concerns and meet with them or meet with their staffers. I mean, their staffers are really important. So you can call and talk with their offices and let them know about things. And that's been a really effective way, I think, for communities to get legislation up in different locations. I mean, that's why when the firefighters are very organized, so if there's something that's important to them, they know how to talk to their representatives and get things going. So that's really important, because you're a voter, right? You can vote for them or not vote for them, and that's really that's an important part of our system. So I would suggest starting with whatever it is that represents you, and if they have a contrary perspective, then that becomes a little bit more difficult, right? And that I don't know as much about, and I would let other people who know more answer that particular question. I will say one other thing though, and it's not about legislation as much, but it's about getting the research done for you as a community member to answer your questions. And I'd like to come back, if I could, for a moment to Tucson Fire Department. So I've worked with Tucson Fire Department for almost 30 years now. And these last set of research that we had that was funded by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, where we were looking at exposures on the fire ground and ways to reduce the exposure and getting additional information to help workers' comp cases. This has truly been a community engaged research project. And I'm sure you've heard that term many times before. And everybody has kind of slightly different definitions of it. But in my mind, it means that the question comes from the community, that the community helps decide how you're going to do it, that they help collect the information, they help you analyze the information, and they help you present the information. So they're a partner all through the process. And that has been the way that our work with Tucson Fire Department has gone. They came to us when one of their investigators, people who looked for arson or other reasons a fire might have started, got leukemia and died. His case was not accepted, even though it was a workers' comp case that under the presumptive cancer laws. And it wasn't accepted until after he died. So it dragged him along, also his family. He did not get the medical care that he needed. And he told his colleagues, including one of my, particularly good friends and colleagues at Tucson Fire Department, Captain John Galata, never to let this happen to anybody else. He used more colorful language than that, as you can imagine, the firefighter, but that and therefore with that, Tucson Fire Department, given our years of working together, said we need to do something about this. And we came up together with our study aims, things that would suit the government and look good for other researchers, but ultimately that would come up with answers that they could use. And they put two things in place. They put one called engineers on air, and engineers are the guys that operate the trucks. Other people go into the fire, right? Engineers are sitting out there, they're making sure the pump's working or the ladder, things like that. If the wind switches direction, they can go from no smoke to being in smoke. And so they decided, based on our initial data, that we found a whole bunch of chemicals from the combustion products in their urine. So it got into their body from breathing and through their skin, got into their urine, we measured it, and they had high levels in the engineers as well as the people who went into the fires. So they knew that was a problem. Everyone who went into the fires had elevated levels as well. So they did two things. They put the engineers on air. So they had them wear their SCBA, and they did a wash down of everybody right after they came out of the fire with soap and water before they took their gear off. And by doing that, we could reduce their exposures by a third or more. So we actually measured before they did the interventions in place, after a fire, and then afterwards. And they were able to significantly reduce their exposures. That is now the workplace process for Tucson Fire Department. They were involved in all the steps, part of our publications, and they're sharing that information throughout the country with other fire departments. That is community engaged research, and that is, I think, the most effective way to do things. And furthermore, it's much more fun as a researcher because you're working directly with someone who cares and will do something with the results of your research.
Absolutely. Yeah. Public outrage seems like a very powerful thing to be able to channel and make it work for something that's going to turn it around and turn something positive out of all these things that are being seen.
And I would say, our role as a researcher is not necessarily to channel that, but it's to provide the community the resources and the information they need for them to make the decisions that will help them the most.
Kind of empowering that community.
Yes.
Awesome. So I want to make sure that we have enough time to go to our next slide where we show your email address in case anybody had any questions that we weren't able to get to in our chat. Upcoming webinars that we want to plug here. Tuesday, August 4th, we're going to have the representatives from the College of Nursing here one more time, but this time in Español, so that we can get more Spanish speakers to enroll in this study, hopefully. And then Tuesday the 18th, we are going to be having representatives from North Country Healthcare talking about Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. So the downwinders program that they have up in Northern Arizona, similar to the stuff that we're talking about here. But this is radiation exposure up in North Country. And so if we go to our next slide, we can see if anybody has any other questions that we did not get to today, please send us an email, follow us on our social media accounts, and then we have our red cap link right there. I believe we have one question that came in through the chat from Bettina Hoffaker, who we're going to be interviewing here soon. But as hikers at the Santa Catalinas following the Bighorn fire, where could we look for safety information as when it will be safe to get back on the dirt trails? Thank you for all the research you have completed and ongoing on this topic.
My understanding is that a lot of the mountain has been, I know that the mountain has been closed, right? I mean, I think we all do that. Can't go up there, right? At least driving up the highway. And I think that, if you're hiking in an area that, I think the biggest concern, I believe, that's out there is flash flooding, right? So, because now you don't have the vegetation there to soak up the water, so it can come right down. So I think if you're hiking anywhere on the mountain that you could get to, and I do the Finger Rock Trail myself all the time, but I haven't been there in a while. I don't know if it's open or closed, honestly, but I would just be careful with flash floods, particularly in the monsoon season here. and because they're going to be worse than they would normally would be. Otherwise, you know, I think the smoke should be gone in all the places now, right? The fire's out. So just if you're getting a lot of soot on you probably should clean it off, you know, as soon as you can, is what I would say. But I think the main concern right now would be flash flooding in the monsoon season for people who wanted to go hiking. And you just really want to make sure that if your hike took you through a wash, that, you know, you could easily get out of it if it came.
Very good to know. And then, so because of COVID-19 and the shutdown of the state during the legislative session, how was that Senate Bill 1160 impacted?
I'm not sure what the final decision was on that. So I think it made it through it made it through the Senate, and then maybe was not decided in the House. So I don't know the final word on that. Senator Carter would certainly know. So that came kind of after our involvement in the process and after the testing. So I'm not sure where it was left, honestly.
Okay. And what other research are you currently participating in with the COVID-19 pandemic?
We're actually continuing to work with firefighters, but also other first responders and frontline workers. We have two current projects. One's working, it's called Recover. It's funded by the CDC through a company called APT. And we're partnering with the University of Miami and the Tucson Fire Department and fire departments in the Miami area. And so we want to look and see what the risks are for COVID-19 in firefighters, and particularly, you know, what occupational exposures they have that could, you know, things that they could do to protect themselves better. And furthermore, to kind of understand what your risk, even if you do have COVID-19, is of getting it again. That's the smaller study that'll have about 400 firefighters altogether. And then we were recently funded by the CDC directly to have a new project called Arizona Heroes. And that involves healthcare workers, first responders, so firefighters and law enforcement and corrections, and a lot of categories of essential workers, so people who work in restaurants, people who work in grocery stores, people working in 911 call centers, people who work in utilities, anyone who could be working with the public or with others and could potentially be exposed that way. And the big question there for us is, can you get COVID-19 again once you have it? That's the biggest question, because we don't know the answer to that. So we're going to follow people over time to help answer that question. But also it has 4,000 individuals. So we expect to be able to also look really closely at occupational risks for all of these groups to see ways that we might be able to better protect them as well.
That's great. I'm sure that's keeping you really busy.
It's a very busy time. If you have anything to do with COVID-19, it's a very, very busy time. Yes.
We don't want to take up too much more of your time, Dr. Burgess. So if there are no other questions from the audience, I think we can end here. One, thank you for joining us today and providing us more information about the research you're doing. So thank you for joining us. And again, our contact information is below. And if you would, we would like you to do our evaluation, the red cap and the QR code is below, and also follow us on social media for more upcoming webinars that we will be conducting.
But thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you and to share the results of our research with the community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burgess. Super interesting stuff. Thanks for the work you're doing.
Take care. Stay safe.
You as well. Thank you so much. Have a great